All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for coming. It's really, really beautiful out, so I appreciate you guys being willing to sit in a dark, windowless room on October 4th here in the mountains. And there are much, much more, well, maybe not interesting, but relaxing things to do outdoors. My name is Andrew Denson. I work down the road here at Western Carolina University, where I teach history. I also participate a little bit with the Cherokee Studies program down there. Prior to coming here, my research was Cherokee history, but in the West. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about my current research project. I'm in the midst of writing a book about the history of the commemoration of Cherokee removal. So I'm not so much interested, I am interested in removal, obviously, itself, the historical events. What I'm primarily interested in for this research is the way in which people in the 20th century in the South have remembered removal in public. So I study things like monuments, museums, public celebrations, anniversaries, that kind of thing. I also, and obviously this association, which I'm a member of, is also involved in that work, is probably the most important organization presently involved in that work. So this is about not so much the Trail of Tears itself, but the way in which the Trail of Tears has been remembered in public. And as most of you here will know, there's like a lot of this stuff. There is a ton of commemoration for pretty much off and on, at least over the last century, of Cherokee removal. Not all of it is great commemoration or accurate or what we would consider today to be satisfying, but there's really quite a lot of it. And in fact, when I started this project years and years ago, I thought I was just going to write a couple of articles about this, kind of in between other book projects, but instead it ended up kind of taking over my life because there's just so much of this stuff out there, so many monuments, so many museums, so many historic sites, and it goes so far back. I think there are at least three big eras of removal commemoration. First, in the early part of the 20th century, especially in the 1930s, there's a pretty significant wave of Trail of Tears commemoration. Some of this has to do, as I'll talk about, with the 100th anniversary of Cherokee removal, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with just the tourism boom that began at that time in this part of the world, especially here in southern Appalachia, and then in the communities surrounding southern Appalachia. I'll talk about why I think that's the case. Second, there's an even larger wave of commemoration in the 1950s and 60s, and this is when you begin to see, especially historic sites being developed by states. So this is when New Echota in Georgia gets going. It's when the Van House restoration is completed. It's when the Trail of Tears State Park in Missouri is created. So you see historic sites developing in the 1950s and 60s. And then finally, beginning in sort of the mid-80s or so, you have the even larger, very, very large wave of commemoration that we're all part of today. And the National Heritage Trail obviously is a big part of this. The Trail of Tears Association is a big part of this. And I think really the Heritage Trail and this organization have provided a kind of catalyst whereby communities, many more communities really than ever before, have gotten involved in commemorating and remembering this part of American history. And I don't have to tell you guys that because you're all involved in this, as I am myself. Now, public memory interests scholars basically because commemoration seems to provide like a window onto the culture of the people doing the commemorating. Right? What we remember from history says a lot about sort of how we think about ourselves. It says a lot about our identities, what we think are, what we think are important values. So it's to not just the past, but what's happening in the present, whenever that present is. So academics, historians, folks like me, are interested in thinking about commemoration because it gets you into the culture of the people doing the commemorating. So in my current work, I ask why Southern communities have chosen to remember Cherokee removal. During these various periods, what are the kind of conditions in which you see people turning to Native American history as an important subject in their own history. And then what can these commemorations tell us about what's going on in, say, 1930, the South in the 1930s or the mountains in the 1930s? What can it tell us about Southern culture in the 1950s and 60s when you see a lot of these historic sites popping up? For this meeting, meanwhile, I think there's an additional benefit to discussing some of these past commemorations, which is that they can kind of invite us to reflect on our own work as commemorators, right? I mean, everybody in this room, including myself, were involved in public history, in public memory, in remembering this particular part of American history. And I think sometimes looking at these older examples of commemoration can maybe teach us some lessons about our own work, and if nothing else, they can provide a way of kind of reflecting on our work as memory makers in our own right. At least that's what it's done for me, I think, and that's mainly the purpose of this talk today. So with that in mind, let me describe a few examples of trail from the early 20th century, especially the 1930s, the first of these periods that I identified. And I'm going to talk around about 15 minutes or so and show some pictures, and then you guys can ask questions, or we can just talk about whatever you want to talk about. So to begin with, there are of course examples of Cherokee commemoration prior to the 1930s. In particular, some local heritage organizations, especially the Daughters of the American Revolution in the South, got very, very into Indian history at the beginning of the 20th century. And I haven't sort of untangled exactly why that's the case, but I have some theories. The important thing, though, is that the Daughters, beginning around 1910 or so, begin to erect a lot of monuments to Indian history. And in this part of the world, that means they're erecting monuments to Cherokee history and Cherokee figures. And so these will probably be familiar to some of you. So this is, for example, the Nancy Ward Gravesite Memorial near Benton, Tennessee, which was, it says 1923. I think it was the bronze plaque was cast in 1923. I think it's actually set up in 1925. Set up by the Nancy Ward chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So clearly this is an important figure as far as that group is concerned if they're going to name it after themselves. You also have near here, or not too far from here, the Junaluska Memorial at Junaluska's grave. This is the original DAR monument. This is a picture of the dedication of that monument in 1910. And both the Nancy Ward grave and the Junaluska grave have since been, as you guys know if you've been there, to either of those places, have been kind of recontextualized, or like new monuments around them. And that I find really fascinating too. You get these really interesting conversations between these different layers of commemoration. Present day commemoration kind of talks to this, especially at the Junaluska monument, because you have a very different sort of story told by the new monument compared with the old one. Now, DIR chapters, when they commemorated Indian history at this period at least, they tended to gravitate toward what I think of as kind of helper Indian stories. And I don't mean to be overly critical of the DIR, but when you look at what they set up in sort of 1910 and the 1920s into the 30s, they tend to be figures who these chapters could define as helpers of the founding fathers or early American kind of heroic figures. So in the case of Junaluska, you can't really see that terribly well, but what the monument emphasizes is the famous story, legend of Junaluska saving Andrew Jackson's life at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Did that happen? We don't really know. At the very least, Cherokees do help the United States at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. They're American allies in the Creek War in 1813. We don't really know whether Junaluska literally saved his life, but that story sort of speaks to that role that Cherokees play as allies. But what happens with this monument is that it kind of defines Junaluska solely as a helper of the United States, and in particular Andrew Jackson, with all the kind of irony that goes along with that. So I don't know if you can see this, but it says, saved the life of General Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and for his bravery and faithfulness, North Carolina made him a citizen and gave him land in Graham County. The date of his death is incorrect here, but that's less important. And so what happens basically with this monument is that Junaluska is turned, is kind of taken from his Cherokee context and kind of turned into a North Carolinian, right? I mean, turned into like, an honorary friend of Andrew Jackson. And there's a lot missing in between those like two sentences, right? I mean, Junaluska, of course, he and other Cherokees are allies of Jackson in that war. But of course, Junaluska is a much more complicated figure. He's also someone who resists removal in 1838. He comes back, he's captured, he escapes, he's captured again, he comes back. And yes, he is given land by North Carolina, but of course it's his land, right? I think he's someone who, he resists removal. And so what these monuments tend to do is to sort of reduce the figures to that kind of helper role. In a way that, I think is understandable, but is, I think by kind of contemporary standards, not entirely acceptable. And so, the newer monuments that have been set up around this site and some of the other ones have sought to kind of correct and like recontextualize those earlier monuments. In the case of the Nancy Ward grave, this one I think is especially interesting, not so much for the text, but for the background, because the daughters in the early 20th century in East Tennessee, their main object of veneration, I've found, and this makes sense, are those early settlers in like the Watauga settlements, and like and they very much venerate the Over Mountain Man story, the background to the Battle of Kings Mountain. And there are good reasons for them to do that. That kind of complicates things when it comes to Cherokees, though, because of course they're in the Revolution, the Cherokees are for the most part the enemies of the people who the DAR are venerating in this case. And so what they do with Nancy Ward at this time is they, sort of like Junaluska, they take her out of her Cherokee context and turn her into almost like an honorary founding mother, right? Because they define her in terms of as being like a friend of the Watauga settlements, because they're the famous chapters of her warning early Tennessee settlements of impending Cherokee attacks. They take her, they focus on that context and remove her from, figuratively, from her Cherokee context and turn her into, again, like a founding mother of Tennessee, much in the same way that the Junaluska monument kind of takes Junaluska out of his Cherokee context and turns him into, strictly a friend of Andrew Jackson. And again, I think it makes sense why these commemorations would develop in those ways, why they would emphasize those stories. But of course, the result of this is that you get a flattening of those historical figures. Nancy Ward is about as complex, as complicated a historical figure as I can think of, right? I mean, really, really fascinating, complicated historical figure. In this case, though, she's sort of flattened into something like a caricature, and it's required a lot of work by more recent commemorators to kind of recomplicate that story. Again, I don't want to be sort of too critical of these, if only because the fact that these monuments exist allow that later commemoration, that later recontextualization, and so I think it's incredibly important, incredibly valuable that the Dars of the American Revolution inscribed the landscape with these monuments and with these stories. But that said, I think these offer a bit of a cautionary tale to those of us who are involved in public history today, because they encourage us, I think, to, they encourage me to ask not just what I'm including in my history, but also what I'm excluding, right? I mean, you can't tell everything, especially not in a sort of 2-foot square bronze plaque. And so, in my writing or in the other work I do, I try to remind myself, as a result of thinking about these monuments, remind myself to consider what I'm leaving out as well as what I'm including, and to understand that those are, those have to be sort of like conscious choices, and they're important choices, especially if you're going to write this history on the land itself or for future generations to read. So early monuments. Those early efforts are important, but as I mentioned, the larger wave of Trail of Tears commemoration develops a little bit later than those monuments. It develops during the 1930s, and especially is tied to the creation of the national park, which is, I'm not sure which direction to point from here, but is just outside of border of the Qualla boundary here. In the late 1920s, Congress approved the creation of the Great Smokies National Park. The Qualla boundary is just outside the southern border of that park. And at least by about 1930 or 1931, the road that goes from Gatlinburg to Cherokee had been at least proposed, and that's what you're seeing on this mapping part. The dotted line here is the road that they had to build to connect those two places. I mean, some of you probably came over that road and coming here, right? So I mean, that road is, they're talking about it by about 1930 or so. What that does, basically, the proximity of the reservation land to the national park and then the building of that road, what that means is that all of a sudden, this community that we're in right now suddenly becomes the central focus of economic planning in this part of the world. I think in a way that wasn't the case a little, in earlier periods. You have people in Tennessee, people in North Carolina, people, on the national level, if you're talking about the Park Service, all of a sudden thinking about this town right here. And so you have Cherokee moving from kind of the margins of the, if you will, the consciousness of, folks in like Waynesville, where I live, or Asheville. It moves to the center of things. And when that happens, they begin to think not just about how, tourists are going to be coming through Cherokee. They begin to think about, okay, what in Cherokee can be brought into tourism development? And that has an effect on how people think about history, I think. What you see, and actually these maps, I think, sort of show that process nicely. These are maps from Knoxville newspapers, principally. Maps that are promoting the park development and kind of drumming up interest and boosting the park effort and the effort of people in Knoxville to prepare for the opening of the park. These early maps you see, it's fairly skeletal, it's fairly empty. As people think more about these maps, you begin to literally see things being, the spaces being filled in on these maps. And so I've kind of zoomed in on this. It's not a very good image because it was just with a digital camera in the archive in the basement over in Gatlinburg. But you see various kind of cultural things being put on that landscape, including the Indian reservation and these sort of stereotypical kind of like TVs and planes Indian images. And these are sort of, they're kind of funny, but if nothing else, I think what they demonstrate is, or they illustrate the way in which once you start thinking about this landscape as important, as something that people are going to drive from all over the country to see, you begin to think not just about the landscape, the trees, the mountains, the scenic beauty, but you begin to think about like culture and history as well. And I think that's a really, really important process for explaining why during the same period you begin to see a lot of Cherokee, or at least some Cherokee commemoration in various communities around here. There's this process whereby, once you've decided that this landscape is important, is scenic, is something that has to be preserved and should be showcased. Once you decide that, it's almost like you see these like stories and cultural images being attracted to that landscape. And people say, okay, well, if it's scenically beautiful, well, what's going on here historically? What's going on here culturally? And that really affects how people think about the past, I think. So a number of historians have noted, for example, that in the promotional literature for the national park, both Native American people and non-Indians are kind of represented as people of the past. I mean, especially actually Appalachian whites in this promotional literature are presented as people who have sort of retained their kind of 18th century or early 19th century customs. And this is still something that drives people in Appalachia crazy, right? This image of Appalachia as being kind of backwards, as being lodged somewhere back in the misty past, maybe around the Revolution, maybe a little bit later. So you get this historical, stereotyped historical image that is very, very prominent in the way in which the park comes to be marketed, and in the way in which tourism development generally comes to be marketed in this part of the world. Same thing is true of the the Cherokees, you get this promise that, well, if you come to this landscape, you'll not only see nice mountains, but you will see, Indians, and they'll be real Indians, right? They will, and they will, you'll be able to experience an old culture. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that, right? Although, as the little sort of cartoon doodle suggests, maybe it's not the images that are selected maybe aren't the ones that we might today prefer. Anyway, the important thing is the way in which the park, once it's designated, begins to kind of alter the way people are thinking about the past, because then that sets up the possibility that people will think not just about the Cherokees in a general way, but will start to think about particular Cherokee historical episodes. And removal begins to be a prominent part of at least some tourism developments. So in the 1930s and early 1930s, you have public festivals in both Knoxville and Asheville that are Native American themed and that prominently feature Cherokee performance, Cherokee dance, stickball games become a really big thing in these public festivals. They also involve these very, very elaborate historical pageants in the 1930s. This is kind of the tail end of historical pageants at one time were like a really huge thing in a lot of American communities at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. This is sort of late in the pageantry period, but in the midst of tourism development, you get a lot of communities putting on these very, very elaborate plays, involving hundreds and hundreds of people in which they depict their local and regional history. And in this context, this immediate sort of Smoky Mountains area, Cherokee history becomes an increasingly prominent part of those pageants. So there's one in Knoxville. There were several in Knoxville in the early 1930s. Which are clearly meant to drum up interest in just tourism development generally. Some of them involve basically non-Indians playing Cherokees. Sometimes, though, they involve Cherokees, people from the Eastern Band coming over the mountains and participating in those pageants. The Eastern Band itself, in 1935, holds a pageant during the Fall Fair, which is starting today. And that's repeated in the summer of 1937. They hold a very large, again, hundreds of people participate in these lavish depictions of local history, and in this case, Cherokee history. Removal is a big part of those pageants. The Trail of Tears story is told in those pageants. And this Cherokee one, I think, I don't have an image that goes along with it. I have a program for it, but I don't have a particularly good scan of it. The Cherokee the Cherokee pageant, I think, is especially worth noting. This one was written and directed by a woman named Margaret Pearson Spielman, who was a white woman who worked for the BIA. She worked for the Indian Service in the 1920s and 1930s. She taught at a series of Indian boarding schools, mostly in the West. She's basically like she was very famous for this. She's like the Indian Education Service's drama coach, essentially. She does this in Haskell and Chilocco and a couple of other places, and these pageants would be used by boarding schools to promote the schools themselves, to kind of like offer PR for the schools. And what happens in Cherokee is that the agent in Cherokee, who's a guy named Harold Fote, knows Spielman. He had worked out in the West, and when people in Cherokee begin to think about tourism development, he basically calls her in. He asks the Indian Service to reassign her for a summer to Cherokee, North Carolina, so she can put on this large, lavish historical production. While she was a non-Indian person, everybody in the pageant was Cherokee. She works through the schools here in Cherokee, especially the main federal school in Cherokee. And the people who acted in this were either current students or people who had been through the boarding school system. And so while most of the time these pageants involve white people playing Indians, in this case the Indians are playing the white people as well as the Cherokees, which is, if nothing else, kind of interesting to think about. And this involves some really, really prominent people. Will West Long is in this pageant. Some of the members of the Cherokee government, the Cherokee Tribal Council are in this pageant. And so it's a very, very big deal, and it's something that even though it's directed by a non-Indian, becomes kind of a community, a community production. The other interesting thing that's really interesting about or that's useful, I think, about the Cherokee pageant is the way it depicts removal. In most of these pageants, removal is like the end of the Indian portion of the history. So if you go to the Knoxville pageant in 1933 or 1934, you have a big kind of showcase of removal, but it's a disappearing Indian story, right? I mean, the Indians kind of go away, and then it's on to talk about the Civil War or something, or talk about the rise of Knoxville's industrial greatness or something. In this one, obviously, that's not going to be the case. In the Eastern band's depiction of their history, removal is important, but it's more a story about persistence, right? It's a story about surviving removal, about staying in the mountains and revitalizing after the Trail of Tears. And I think that's really instructive, right? Because whereas oftentimes, I think even today, removal will be depicted as something like a disappearing Indian story, which is one of the oldest stereotypes in American culture of Indians. In this one, it doesn't have to be about disappearing Indians. It becomes about survival, about persistence, about revitalization. And that has not just a historical meaning for Cherokees in the 1930s, it also has a political meaning, I think, in the 1930s. So the pageants, I think, are a key example of this memory being broadcast in public, being written on the landscape, being growing in people's perceptions of the past. Removal even became part of a nationally sponsored celebration in the late 1930s, and this is it's a brochure from that celebration. This is the Chickamauga Celebration from Chattanooga, September 16th to 25, 1938. As the brochure here sort of indicates, this is primarily a commemoration of the Civil War. It's the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga, and they also kind of talk about Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain in this celebration. In addition to that, it's a commemoration of the centennial of Chattanooga, the 100th anniversary of Chattanooga, the city. But what happens is that as they're planning this commemoration, they begin to think about maybe including Indian history in this as well. And they, in the midst of the planning, they note that, well, yeah, 1938 is the centennial not only of the founding of Chattanooga, but necessarily it's also the centennial of removal. And so as they're planning this, they decide, oh, well, maybe we can include, Indian material in this as well. There's also an air show involved, which is why you have fighter planes up there. When I was putting together these slides, I noticed that, well, yeah, we're fighting the Battle of Chickamauga, and there are planes in the air. So sure how that, I'm sort of picturing the Confederate Air Force coming into save the day. But I think that's supposed to refer to the air show that they put on. This was something that started, like most of these things, as a local effort, and in particular, the person behind this seems to have been Zella Armstrong. Anyone familiar with Zella Armstrong's work? Yeah, I mean, she's very, very significant commemorator, newspaper woman, publisher in the 1920s, 1930s in Chattanooga. She writes local history, but she's also the publisher of a really just fascinating society magazine called The Lookout. It's like the local society newspaper. And she is the president at this time, of the Chattanooga Women's Press Club. And it seems to be within the conversations in the Women's Press Club that this commemoration idea originally springs. So Zella Armstrong seems to be the person who first kind of floats this idea of having a celebration of the centennial of Chattanooga and then adding these other elements into it. Armstrong may have also been the person who suggested including Cherokee content, because she was someone who was very interested in the Indian history of that part of Tennessee as well, at least as near as I'm able to tell. It makes sense that there would be a removal commemoration within this festival for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that if you're going to talk about the founding of Chattanooga, you sort of have to get the Cherokees out of there first. I mean, it's not a coincidence that it's both, 1938, the standing of both, because, of course, this is a Cherokee place until removal. And so if you're going to have the non-Indian city of Chattanooga, removal has to be in there someplace. So it makes sense for that reason. In addition to that, Chattanoogans at this time, or like historically minded Chattanoogans at this time, hold a particular place in their local memory, I think, for the history of the Cherokee Nation. And Armstrong in particular, I think that this is true. They identify Ross's Landing and the Brainerd Mission basically as the essential kind of precursors to the city that they live in. And so it's not just a question of saying, oh yeah, well, Indians were here before us. It's more that the Cherokees who are at the Brainerd Mission and the Cherokees who are involved in Ross's Landing, I mean, the Ross family in particular, become kind of symbolic founders of the city in some of the ways in which Chattanoogans at this time recount their local history. And so for that reason as well, removal is an important story for them. And then finally, by 1938, in lots of other communities around here, as I've been talking about, you already have Cherokee history as a tourism attraction, right? And so it makes sense that you would draw it into this festival as well as it gets larger and larger and as it becomes more elaborate. That said, the inclusion of Cherokee removal in the celebration makes for kind of a interesting dissonance in the commemoration, because the Civil War commemoration at this period tends to emphasize heroic sacrifice for the nation, and then especially reconciliation, right? Regional sectional reconciliation after the war. And that's especially important in the late 1930s because, of course, it's clear that war is coming in Europe. The United States doesn't know whether it's going to be part of it, but at very least it's important to unite the country to face whatever international challenges lie ahead. So you have an emphasis on patriotism and reconciliation, this heavily nationalist message in Civil War commemoration. Then in terms of the centennial of Chattanooga, you have an emphasis on basically progress, right? I mean, if you've ever gone to town or city anniversary celebrations, it's always about progress, right? Chattanooga, I'm from Chicago, we do this all the time. Chicago is always rising, right? It's always, becoming stronger and more industrial and more wealthy and all that kind of thing. And so centennials for cities and towns tend to focus on, progress. It's these seamless stories of everything getting better all the time. So you revere the past, but everything is always progressing. Now, within those themes, when you throw removal into it, you get this very odd kind of dissonance, again, a kind of contradictory feel within the commemoration, because in the middle of all of this, you have this story that is portrayed as a tragedy, as a crime, as sort of obviously a very terrible thing to do, and it just doesn't quite match up with the other themes in the commemoration. And I find that really, really interesting, right? I mean, the removal memory kind of rattles around inside this commemoration, and it doesn't quite fit, and it makes it a much more complex, and at least for me anyway, a much more interesting kind of an event. They end up having a lot of Cherokee content in here. This is it's a week-long festival. They end up dedicating one entire day to the commemoration of removal. They do a number of different things. First, there's of course, a very large pageant that goes on every night as part of this celebration. Involves something like 1,000 or 1,500 people. I'm not sure how they get them all in one place, but that's what the newspapers say. And that pageant involves a lot of Cherokee material. It involves a long section on removal. And then on the day that's set aside for a Cherokee commemoration, they expand that Cherokee content even more. And so they invite basically the same sort of people who are involved in the pageant I talked about in Cherokee. They come to Chattanooga and are part of that pageant as part of the Chickamauga Celebration. So you have this dramatic representation of removal history. In addition to that, there are delegations, kind of official delegations from both the Eastern Band and the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma that attend this. So Jared Blythe, the principal chief of the Eastern Band, along with members of the council and other kind of dignitaries, he comes over and attends this. Jesse Bartley Milam, who is, I think, about to be appointed at this point, about to be appointed the chief of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. He comes over with other kind of Cherokee dignitaries from the West. And in fact, I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think this event plays a role in Milam's thinking about heritage tourism in Oklahoma. Milam becomes someone who is seen as sort of like one of the people who came up with the idea of having like a Cherokee Heritage Center in Park Hill or in Tahlequah. And I think part of his, that idea comes out of his experience of this commemoration and part of his interaction with Eastern Band leaders during this celebration. And then the last thing that they do, which I find really interesting, is that they travel, they get together local Chattanoogians and a lot of the Cherokee participants, and they take what they call a pilgrimage around this area, and they go to the Brainerd Mission, they go to the John Ross House, they go to the site of Winfield Scott's headquarters, and a couple of other places, and as they go around, they dedicate new monuments to these various parts of removal history. And that to me is really interesting because what happens is that, even though Cherokee history is kind of an afterthought in this celebration, once they decide to recognize it and commemorate it, it becomes a context in which Cherokees and non-Indians establish a bunch of other commemorations, right? They like remark the landscape with the story of removal, and a lot of those monuments are still around. I mean, some of the monuments, if you go out to Brainerd Mission, come from are set up or unveiled during this celebration, and so the celebration becomes a context for further commemoration. Those monuments in turn can become a setting of their own right for further commemoration. So again, even though it's an afterthought, it becomes probably, for the 1930s, one of the largest single commemorations of Cherokee removal, or at least it's the largest I've found so far. So what, I think at the beginning I promised some lessons, right? What do these tell us? And I guess I've gone farther than 15 minutes, didn't I? Sorry, that's what happens when you sort of give a history teacher a room, just run on at the mouth. What might these tell us? I mean, first, I think this speaks to the power of tourism and tourist development to provide a context in which people kind of remake the historical identities of places. Oftentimes when historians talk about tourism, we kind of like hold our noses, like tourism is a dirty subject. It's about making money and all that. But in this case, I mean, tourism, regardless of how you feel about it, and I live in a tourist town, so I'm always pretty ambivalent about it, right? Tourism provides a context in which Cherokee stories become much more important. It's not like all of the stories are there, and a lot of the commemoration is, to us, seems kind of trite and stilted. But still, it becomes tourism becomes a context in which Cherokee history is like invited into the public realm, and I think that's a really important part of this history. As some of the monuments I've talked about indicate, however, just including, in this case, Cherokee history, isn't enough to guarantee sort of satisfying commemoration, though, right? I mean, the pageants, many of the pageants become disappearing Indian stories. A lot of the monuments exclude as much history as they include. And so I think one of the lessons of this is that inclusion isn't enough. As we work in public history, we have to be very careful about what we include, how we tell these stories, and we have to think not just about our own immediate time, but what these stories are going to mean to future generations of people who encounter them. And then finally, I think these monuments, and especially that last example, the Chickamauga Celebration, kind of indicate the benefit of leaving some of the contradictions and the messy elements of history intact as we represent history in public. the past is in fact messy, it's contradictory, it doesn't sort of tell us really easy or simple or straightforward messages or lessons. And I think it's worth retaining that messiness. I think as either a teacher or someone involved in public history, my impulse is always to try and smooth things out and come up with some kind of unified theme, unified story, unified message. I think it's worth keeping the contradictions in there. When people in Chattanooga included Cherokee history, they weren't thinking, we want to complicate our picture of the local past, but that's exactly what they did by bringing in this this tragic story, this dark story into their celebration, quote unquote. They made their celebration much more complicated. And I think for at least some visitors, that made the local history more open. It made them less reassuring, but it ends up being more alive. I think I'll end with that. Thank you. And we have a little bit of time. I'm sorry, I talked way too long there. The one tomorrow morning will be much shorter, I promise. Yes, sir.
I have a question about, I've always heard that General Escalator said that if he had known what was going to come as far as the treatment of the Cherokee by Jackson, that he wouldn't have saved his life. Is that just a made-up thing, or is there any truth to that?
That'd be my guess. I'm not sure. I think...
I'm sure you've heard that.
Yeah. I mean, the key... the key point is that story... captures really
it makes
well.
Sense.
Yeah, the contradiction, right? And and certainly if I were General Wescoe, I would have said something like that.
Right.
Whether I think this is one of those things like Andrew Jackson saying, John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. It would have been appropriate for him to say that, but we don't really know whether he did or not. I mean, that's my guess about General Wescoe.
I just wondered.
What's that?
Colonel Hunter appears to believe.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I didn't talk about that. Yes.
Do you know when the term Trail of Tears was
I always get that. I never do.
It came in.
I'm not sure. There are probably people here who are better able to do that. I know there's kind of a debate about that, and so I'm not sure who's won that debate. So
Do you know the debate?
Not well enough to delineate it. I mean, I think it comes potentially from a couple of different sources, not necessarily even Cherokee sources. The term is in use by the period I'm talking about. So when the story becomes when the episode becomes a bigger part of the historical consciousness of Southern communities, it's already in place. And I think that's part of not exactly the appeal, but part of why it resonates is that there are these sets of images, and there's this language built into it that is just immediately gripping.
Okay.
But I'm not exactly sure. So I probably shouldn't, especially in this crowd, I probably shouldn't make a guess. Yes, sir?
I think this is so interesting to think about, particularly for us who are involved in presenting a piece of history, and particularly one that's so fraught with emotion. I wonder if you have, if you can get enough distance to compare what we are trying to do today to some of these earlier commemorative efforts.
Well, it's much better today, I promise.
That's all I want to ask.
Yeah, I mean,
Didn't take you thought.
right. No, I mean, it definitely is much better and much more accurate. One of my favorite of all Trail of Tears monuments, and if is anyone from Knoxville here? Okay.
I grew up there.
Okay, I mean, I love Knoxville, but it's also the site of my favorite bad removal monument, which is although it's a fascinating one, the Solly Memorial, which, if you read this, I mean, first of all, this is in Gatlinburg. It comes out of Knoxville, but it's in Gatlinburg. It's right on the main strip. If you want to, if you're going back that way, Thursday, park, and it's pretty close to where the road bisects. It's really hard to find because it's so small. But it gets the name wrong, or the date wrong. It's got this sort of Indian headdress thing. So I mean, at the very least, clearly, what we're all doing today is much more historically accurate. It's much more appropriate in terms of it's much more sophisticated. right? The look of it, the research that goes into it. I mean, a lot of these early efforts are. I mean, the story is important to people clearly, but outside of like a local context, they don't necessarily have the resources available that a lot of you guys have in your work. And that's not to like downplay the really amazing work that the chapters are doing, but if you're in Chattanooga in 1938, you don't necessarily have the ability to go off to the National Archives for weeks. You don't have the microfilm at that point. One thing, though, that I think is worth bearing in mind, and I think about this a lot when I teach, when I'm involved in public history stuff, is just, I think it's always worth kind of questioning or reflecting on, not necessarily questioning, but reflecting on your own kind of goals and motives in doing this commemoration. What precisely does this story mean to you, and is that the meaning, is your personal meaning, is that what you want to be displayed on the landscape for decades to come, or do you want to step outside of that immediate context and portray it in a different way? I mean, I think thinking about sort of, and also I think it's worth thinking about the way in which oftentimes when we commemorate things, commemoration can become like an act of possession. You sort of like take control of history in a way that can, if we're not careful, can lead to errors, to commemoration that, guys like me 90 years later will kind of say, oh yeah, that's wrong, right? So I mean, it's worth thinking about our own like motivations when we go at this. I mean, it still should be commemorated, obviously, but like I said, it's always worth also thinking about what we're leaving out as we include these stories. Yeah.
I wasn't a Knoxville school child in 1939, so I'm not guilty.
Oh, I thought you were I was going to say.
But I plead innocent on that.
Oh no! I mean, and the thing about this is
I
this is a wonderful story because it really is school kids who do this, and so it's this very, very, sincere, heartfelt response to basically a story that was published in Collier's magazine, which was then republished by the daily newspaper in Knoxville, which then became part of like history lessons in grammar schools all across the city. And so it's this very, very sincere response to the story of removal. But because it's done in sort of like a hasty way without a lot of research on that kind of thing, it ends up being kind of, a faintly ridiculous monument once it's taken out of its original context. I'm not sure whose hand is up first. We'll go. No.
It also strikes me as being written in Hollywood B-movie Indian speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Land of the Great Smokies.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that I think refers more to like the tourism development during this time than anything else, because everything at this time is about the land of the Great Smokies. Is like, what can we do to promote? It was against the latter part of the Depression, right? So, what can we do to promote the local economy? And that invites all sorts of sort of thinking about historical attractions, about commemoration, lots of things that aren't just strictly about the mountains themselves. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is in that kind of stilted, what we now would think of as like, B-movie type of. Yes, sir.
It's a monument like this is like a casino.
I'm not going to answer that. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'd go that far. It's more like it's a reflection of, it's a reflection of economic thinking, though, right? The monument comes about, or this story becomes important to at least not so much the kids, but the people who set up the monument, because they're trying to broadcast to other people that there are historical attractions as well as just natural attractions.
Does anybody ever bring it to their attention that it won't?
Not that I've found. I mean, I wrote an article on this one for, and then the purpose of the article isn't to sort of criticize this necessarily, but to just talk about it as an example of these larger questions. And I haven't found anyone sort of saying, hey, you got the date wrong. Actually, I mean, that mistake that is saying that removal was taking place in 1836 rather than 38-39 is pretty common, I think because they used the date of the ratification of the Treaty of New Chota. it's not that they're just plucking out of anywhere. I think it's just, oh, well, yeah, the tree was ratified in 1836. That must be when it happened. But, which is indicative that, they don't necessarily have the materials there to sort of tell a fuller story, I guess.
I'm sure they want to fix it.
What's that?
I'm sure they.
Well, I don't think anyone knows about this other than, it's like off in a little corner once it was set up. I mean, and that happens to memorials too, right? I mean, once they're set up, if they're not kept alive and relevant, they die, basically. I mean, they don't die, but they become contextualized out of meaning. And that actually, I think, is I mean, for all of us, especially at times when, like, our budgets for historical sites and so forth are being slashed, that's a really important lesson, right? That if these aren't kept alive, if the sites aren't kept alive, if the stories aren't, if the commemoration isn't kept alive, they can basically become silenced, in a sense, by their surroundings. Because what happens to this, originally it's in this nice little park, but as that area grows, I know I'm out of time, as that area grows, it basically all but disappears because the buildings are growing up around it and the street is widened. So when I eventually went to look, when I first went to look for this, it took me like an hour to find this. I knew it was there. It took me like an hour to find it because I kept walking up and down the street trying to find this little park that I had read about in the newspapers in the 1930s. It's just not there anymore. So I mean, if we don't keep the places vibrant and living, they can just sort of shrink into like husks of their former selves.
Well, recommend the feather plucking party and change the date.
Well, I mean, those of you from Tennessee, do a little raid on this, and you can just kind of chip a little circle right there.
Right.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Back to your map, the early map on Cherokee Mountain. I noticed there's a CCC camp. Is there any WPA camps in the Cherokee Little Mountains, Great Little Mountains? And if there were, were Cherokee Indians included in the WPA and the CCC camp?
The Cherokees are definitely included in the CCC. There's the Color Administration, the Bureau has a kind of a debate about how to include Indian workers in public relief programs. And what happens with the CCC is that they're like parallel organizations of Indian, basically CCC troops. I guess I'm not sure what they be. But yeah, they're definitely Cherokees from this community in the CCC working on a lot of the park development.
I was just curious when I saw that, and there's a comparison.
Probably elsewhere. We got squirrels. And I also like that they're noted as being protected, which actually is a slice of kind of important history here, because one of the things that happens when this is a sideline, but one of the things that happens when you designate this place for Appalachian people is that all of a sudden these places where you used to go and to use as like a commons, to gather resources, to gather food, wild food, or to hunt, suddenly that's protected land, right? So in these maps, I find really fascinating because they tell, in their slightly hackneyed way, more than slightly hackneyed way, they tell a lot of really interesting stories about the park. But yeah, to answer the question, they're definitely Cherokees in the CCC. All right, time for that time. Thanks. Sorry I went a little long there, but thanks for listening.